Microphone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune, a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. The program is 25 years old. We began in 1990 on a so-called community radio station, and we now come to you thanks to the good folks at Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our name, News from Neptune, comes from a remark by Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than half a century. Chomsky says in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. So tonight, David Green, David Johnson, and I will try to say something true, or perhaps even a few true things. We are recording this at noon on the 6th of January, Epiphany, and the event is occurring at this hour in Washington, D.C. that hardly been mentioned, I think, in the general news coverage, but I keep having the sense that it might have some significance. So by the time you see this program, you'll know whether my neurosis is working overtime or whether indeed I'm onto something that's actually happening. What I'm referring to is the fact that Vice President Biden is presiding over a joint session of Congress at this hour, and in that joint session, the returns from the Electoral College votes in the various states are opened and counted formally, and a declaration after an hour or two of parliamentary falderall is made of who's won the presidential election. Now, I have not been able to escape the notion that the political establishment in the United States has one more throw of the dice after the election because the outcome was so unpalatable to the American political establishment. And it just occurs to me that it might happen at the formal reading of the votes for the Electoral College. There's a precedent. In the 2004 election, the Green Party, working really for the Democrats, the Green Party candidate arranged to have one senator and one congressperson from California enter objections to the Ohio Electoral College vote in 2004. Ohio was the state, the swing state, really, in that election. That gave it to President Bush on the basis of the rather narrow win in the state of Ohio. So a challenge to the Ohio electoral votes was important. The Green Party acted as a stalking horse for the Democrats and produced a senator and a representative who would make such a challenge. The challenge was eventually set aside by votes in both the House and the Senate. But the precedent was there, and in fact it turns out that the campaign manager for Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate in this last election, was the man who arranged that challenge of the Ohio vote in 2004. So in the back of my mind is the notion, by the time you see this, you'll know if there was anything at all to this this concern of mine. Something too much of this.
But it was, this may be relevant or not, but since the 2004 election, it has been pretty well proved, I think, that Ohio, the victory in Ohio was stolen. I mean, was the result of fraud of various kinds, and that may not have even been known at that point in time. But and not whatever evidence they might have had should have been used in that way. But anyway.
It'll be interesting to see if these concerns really, which would go back at least as far as the 2000 election, these concerns about voting irregularities actually produce between now and the next presidential election some sort of reasonable reform, a reform that would allow, say, all American citizens to vote wherever they happen to be, or that would dispense with the attempts on various sites around the country to limit the franchise. I don't expect to see that sort of reform, mainly because manipulating the vote is in the interest of too many different parties. But hey, it should happen, and it may be that our political class has overplayed its hand this year and gotten people disturbed enough about interference in the election by Americans as well as Russians, that some sort of electoral reform is going to be possible. After all, most Americans know now that the Russians stole the election and gave it to Donald Trump, right?
Wrong. That's what I want to talk about today. This is great.
David.
I mean, first of all, this whole story about the Russians interfering in the election, there's been absolutely no evidence whatsoever to prove this is the case. And in fact, there's been counter evidence from a former diplomat named from Britain named Craig Murray, who was the diplomat to Kazakhstan, a former intelligence officer, said that he actually met the person who leaked the email from the Democratic National Committee. This was not a hack, this was a leak. And you've got to understand too, timing is everything. And when did this story first break that supposedly the Russians interfere with our elections? It happened the day after WikiLeaks released their recent disclosure of all these various documents and emails, including a bunch from the Democratic National Committee, that showed how the Clinton campaign sabotaged the Bernie Sanders campaign in the primary. At that point, the day after, that's when Hillary Clinton comes out and also Leon Panetta starts saying that it was the Russians, it was the Russians, it was the Russians. And this lie has been repeated over and over and over again. And unfortunately, like Hitler's propaganda minister Goebbels said, if an authority figure repeats a lie often enough, eventually it becomes a truth to most people. Now, I want to say there's a lot of people out there that should know better that are buying into this just out of more than anything desperation to try to think of some way to keep Donald Trump out of office. But the thing is, as much as I hate Donald Trump, equally with Hillary Clinton, we can't allow something like this method of trying to prevent Donald Trump from taking the presidency. We can't do this because there's too many other side effects that are going to be much worse than allowing him to take the presidency. In particular, an attack on civil liberties. You see all these stories coming about so-called fake news sites. And it's quite interesting because the Washington Post is the first one that came out with this story, citing one source called Proper Nut, short for propaganda or nut. And it turns out that this source basically was a pretty shadowy group that wouldn't really identify themselves, wouldn't cite their sources, and it just so happens that all these various internet news sites that they listed as supposedly paid for by Russian money, and it was a propaganda agents, were all grassroots real journalism. The sites like Counterpunch, Black Agenda Report, The Intercept, Naked Capitalism, and all these Truth Out, Truth Dig, all these sites that have been producing real journalism as opposed to the real fake news out there, which is the corporate media. And Washington Post publishing a story and not doing a retraction. The most they could get out of Washington Post was saying, quote, believe this or not, that they are not responsible for checking the reliability of their sources. Are you kidding me? What is journalism supposed to be? So, anyway, with that said, I want to get back to this thing. This is as far as the elections. This is the problem people need to be focusing on as opposed to this nonsense about the Russians hacking this election. What we need to focus on is this corrupt and broken electoral system we have in this country that goes, as Carl mentioned, goes back to the year 2000. Greg Palast, the American investigative journalist who can't get a job with a news organization in the United States, but is well known internationally, works for the BBC, The Guardian, and other news outlets as a freelance journalist. And he's the one that broke the story of the stolen 2000 election in Florida, and then later again in Ohio in 2004. Just so happens he has a new movie out called The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. And part one of that will be shown on Labor's View TV this Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. here on Urbana Public Television. And I really highly watch this film. And as Greg Palast, I show in the film, I have a little clip of an interview with Greg Palast by Paul Jay from the Real News Network. I showed that in the beginning, right before part one, in which Greg Palast says both the Republican and the Democratic parties benefit from this corrupt and broken system. With the Democrats, it's primarily in the Democratic primaries in order to keep corporate control of the Democratic Party and to disenfranchise those people who are most likely to vote for progressive populist candidates that are running in Democratic primaries. And interestingly enough, those people that are targeted are usually African Americans, Latinos, younger people, as well as lower class working people. In other words, working poor. And so, again, in the Republicans, they have mastered this as far as the in general elections. Florida in 2000, Ohio in 2004, and now this most recent election, there's a lot of good evidence that they were use a system called cross-check voting, in which basically somebody that tries to vote in some of these states that don't allow people to vote that have a previous felony conviction, they basically, if their name matches anyone with the same name anywhere in the country that's had a felony conviction, they're automatically denied the right to vote, and then it's up to that person to try to prove that it's not them, and by that time the election's over. So this is the problem. We have a corrupt system in this country, an electoral system that needs to be changed. We need to go to the system like they have in Western Europe, to where you're automatically registered to vote the day you are born, or actually the day you receive a Social Security number, which then becomes effective the day you turn 18 years old. Nobody is, as long as you're a citizen of that country, you're allowed to vote. It doesn't matter if you're living abroad, if you're in prison, or what. If you are still a citizen of that country, you have an absolute right to vote.
I'll take some exception to that, David, in terms of the notion that what's wrong with American politics and the reason we don't have the sort of effective representation of popular needs in our politics is because this is procedural. That it's a matter of these procedures. The procedures are important. I'm not saying that they can be ignored entirely. But I remember a remark of Noam Chomsky's after the 2000 election, in which Chomsky was asked, wasn't he concerned about the procedural problems of the sort you were just talking about in the 2000 election, because it would change the outcome all that much. And Chomsky's response was, it wouldn't have changed the outcome all that much. There's no indication that Al Gore as president would have done anything substantially different from George Bush as president, and that it's pretty clear that American elections are designed to be a matter of flipping a coin between two essentially similar candidates. Now, as I say, this was a discussion 15 years ago. Some people would say that that's changed this year, although I'm not sure that it really has. Well, by this year, I mean in 2016. But his point was, he says, if you're flipping a coin, does it matter too much if the coin is bent? And I think that's about right. I agree with you entirely. What we need is, quite frankly, national identity cards issued at birth, so that every citizen is indicated but with a unique identifier that allows him or her to vote and also receive free medical care, free education, and so forth. That's the sort of organization we need. But the idea that what the problem with American politics is that the procedures are corrupted, that may be right, they may be corrupted, but it's not clear that it's going to change anything.
I never wanted to imply that that was all that's wrong with our system. It's just one of the things that has come to the surface.
In a funny way, I think it's things that are right with this. Look what's happened this last year. I mean, we've had a substantial transformation in American politics, and indeed with world politics, that's slowly coming under the name populism. Everything from the Brexit vote in Britain to the Sanders campaign here to the Trump campaign represent, it seems to me, really a revolution, a formal revolution from below in the political system. there are a lot of people who want to suggest that these things, as it were, have nothing to do with each other, or the standard liberal interpretation, this is just racist nonsense on the part of working class people in Britain and deplorables in the United States. I don't think it's that. I think it's a good deal more than that. And by the way, I think that it's remarkably similar events are occurring throughout the West, for lack of a better term. There are parallels also in other parts of the world. We were talking about the Le Pen candidacy in France before we went on the air. Le Pen is dismissed as a right-winger in various places. No, she's not a right-winger at all. She's an example of the same sort of populist transformation that produces Brexit, Sanders, and Trump. And that's what's happening. That's what's going on. And it's breaking through the vagaries of the electoral system in each of these countries. I think we're going to see more of it. This is the top of the wave, not the end of it.
I'd like to respond, but I need to give David some time here.
Well, maybe you could respond to what I have to say as well.
Okay.
Along these lines, I think I ended last week's program when you weren't here, obviously, David, with the question of how did this red state, blue state thing get going? Who foisted these identities on the American people, that if you live in a red state, I mean, everybody understands that not everybody votes red in a red state and blue in a blue state, but somehow these are seen as markers for the cultures of these states. Generally speaking, the coastal blue states with our own state sort of standing out in this sea, what is now a sea of red in the middle of this country, and then the red states. But and one can say, and at first I was thinking, well, maybe this is basically the liberal way of looking at the political system. This is the liberal identity politics way of looking at the way that the system works. But of course, when you look at cable news and you look at the basic division between CNN and Fox News and MSN and NBC and so forth, we see these things being played out from all sides, as if people can be just categorized and pigeonholed in ways that are truly determining their vote. And I think we have to get back to understanding the basic economic facts of life, especially in the red states. And I think these are the things. This is the denial that's going on among liberals, among Democrats right now, that somehow people in the red states, as you know, Thomas Frank wrote this famous book, What's the Matter with Kansas, in which he argued that people in the red states voted against their economic interests. And it may have been somewhat true then. I don't see how it could be seen as true now.
Exactly.
And just to conclude this, Jeffrey St. Clair noted in his column on Counterpunch this morning that he was looking at a county in something called Vigo County, Indiana, in his home state. I'm not sure if I don't think that's where he's from, but apparently Vigo County has voted with the winner of the presidency every time since 1956. And it voted for Obama in this Republican state, in this red state. It voted clearly for Obama in 2008. It voted less clearly for him in 2012, but he still won there. And in this last election, Trump won in that county decisively. And these are economic issues that are driving these. He also made he made a funny comment at the end that people in Indiana basically wanted to get rid of Governor Mike Pence.
That's right.
And this was the only way they could do it.
Kick him upstairs.
But still, with all the mainstream media denial about the fact that trade loses jobs. The mainstream media, the Washington Post, keeps arguing that it's not trade that loses jobs. And Dean Baker, every other day, is looking at one of these articles and putting up his basic chart there about how in 2000, manufacturing jobs plummeted in ways that they had not plummeted between 1980 and 2000. And that's a result of quote unquote free trade. And people in these red states, these Rust Belt states, know that from their personal experience.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that is just, in a sense, what we were talking about in other terms as populism a moment ago.
Right.
Populism, in that sense, is a direct result of the economic conditions, and as the late Alexander Cockburn used to say, the sky is dark with chickens coming home to roost. And that's what we're dealing with from Vigo County to the banlieues of Paris.
I have to totally agree with everything you said, David. Getting back to what you were mentioning, Carl, the thing is
I
that
hear this coming, David.
okay.
You would honor me with arguing with anything I have to say.
Well, anyway, the thing about the electoral process is that the point about why I stuck this interview with Greg Palast in front of the first part of Best Democracy Money Can Buy is because he clearly goes on for 6 minutes or more about how the Democratic Party is as much uses this broken, corrupt system we have as the Republican Party, that they're part of the system. That's why Al Gore did not challenge the elections, in 2000, except for, well, okay, fine, he did take a case to the Supreme Court, but we're talking about a total of maybe, a week and a half, 2 weeks, and he quoted basically, Greg Palast said that Warren Christopher warned Al Gore that if he didn't stand down, that his career would be toast, meaning the future of anything he wanted to do, whether it was in politics, speaking tours, or whatever. Okay. Same thing with Kerry in 2004. I mean, both times.
Look what happened to him.
Yeah. I mean, in both times it was the Green Party that had to go and recount the votes. And I got some criticisms of Jill Stein this last time, but as far as not going through the Green Party procedures to get approval for this, she did it on her own.
Right.
However,
I
think
disapproved by the Green Party Standing Committee.
Yes, but I think the point is that this is another example of trying to reveal to the American people just how corrupt and broken the system is. I mean, if we can't, the point is the reason why, Carl, that you have two parties that aren't too much different, as Chomsky said, which I have to agree with, is because the Democratic Party has consistently, for the last 30 years, prevented working people and others who are wanting to run the Democratic primaries from getting elected. Rahm Emanuel, back before he became mayor, even before he became Obama's chief of staff, his main job was to make sure that populist, pro-working class candidates were not going to get elected in the primaries out in the Chicago suburbs. The thing is, they would rather lose, the Democratic Party would rather lose a few elections to Republicans than to allow the Democratic Party to change.
Yes, of course.
From its corporate control. So that's why we have, so I agree with you partly, but I think the elections are important. It's not the only tool in the toolbox, but it is still an important tool that if we don't have if the American people don't have the means to get rid of candidates that have betrayed them or elect those who hopefully they think will represent them in a better way, then we don't have a democracy here. And if that's the case, I mean,
but we don't.
We better, start rethinking everything and start doing something to change that. And as far as the Brexit vote, I absolutely agree with you, Carl. This was a working class rebellion, even though a lot of people are trying to say it was racist. However, there were a lot of racist organizations in Britain that took advantage of this, just like the Nazis took advantage of economic discontent in the Weimar Republic to get recruits. It's the same tactic that basically these organizations on the right, these racist organizations, will use economic discontent and try to divert the blame from the real reasons for it and say this because of immigrants, it's because of people of color or whatever.
The Brexit matter is interesting because British politics in this generation really have a sort of mirroring aspect to American politics. The societies are similar enough that to look at the politics of one is to look at the politics of the other in, as it were, a distorting mirror. It's the same thing. The shapes are arranged a little differently, you know, but it's clearly the same picture. The Brexit vote, I think, was most accurately summed up by Richard Tuck, a British scholar in America now, in an article for Dissent, in which he said that the British people who voted for an exit from the EU were voting against the EU in the same way that American voters were voting against trade pacts like NAFTA and the TPP. That what the EU is, finally, is a huge trade pact that draws together the European states, as the Trans-Pacific Partnership was supposed to draw together the Pacific states, with the United States being, of course, the most important one, in what was a investors' rights agreement to bypass democratic forms. The rejection of the bypassing of democratic forms was what was at stake finally in the vote to leave the EU. I'm old enough to remember the foundation of the EU and talking to a German scholar that summer, and I said, well, why is there upset with this EU? It seems like a very good idea to have this sort of union. After all, that's what we Americans do, and clearly we're in advance with politics to anyone else in the world. I was very young. And he turns to me, he says, it's a businessman's club. He says, it's a businessman's club that will be run for businessmen, and therefore a lot of people are concerned about that. Well, you know, those were prophetic words, it seems to me, and that's the reason that Brexit was voted down. The Brexit was voted for, that is, the EU was voted down in Britain, and finally, it's the reason that Trump won, as David was suggesting.
Well, with Brexit, of course, the British people saw what the UE Troika did to Greece. I mean, basically, lower life expectancy there by 10 years because of the austerity and constant riots in the streets. Yes.
But the succession of votes do come from a common social source, so to speak, and they'll continue. I mean, I will bet you now that Marine Le Pen becomes president of France on the same movement that produced these the changes we're talking about. Prime Minister Renzi lost his equivalent of Brexit and had to resign from the prime ministership in Italy, a form of the same movement. And I think we've not heard the end of it by any means in this country or anyplace else.
I'm sure most listeners to this program understand the difference between the European Monetary Union, the Euro, so it's Euro Union, versus the United States with its single currency, but with its single fiscal government, in which people in poorer states benefit in a sense. I mean, that's a complicated issue, but it isn't like the relationship between Greece and the richer states, like in the European Union, like Germany and France. Basically, the European Union and the euro are run for the benefit of those northern European countries, and the southern countries, as well as Britain, to a certain extent, now understand what Britain isn't in the euro, so they don't have to get out of that, and that's probably one reason why the Brexit vote passed, because it wasn't complicated as in Greece by the sort of difficult project of getting out of the euro.
It'll be interesting indeed. I was in Scotland last year and found it very interesting indeed. The politics are very interesting too. There is still a substantial move in Scotland to maintain the connections with Europe, even if England breaks. And so I think the hours of harmless fun yet on this particular horizon. You're watching news from Neptune. We're talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media. Anything else happened this week, gentlemen?
Good riddance to Obamacare. The Senate, I guess, repealed the Obamacare 58 to 42. Now, Before any of you viewers jump to conclusions, I just want to mention that I opposed the Obamacare law when it first went in 2009 for the simple reason that at that time I saw and I wasn't the only one, of course. You know, I stood on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. But I did read the entire bill. And also, I do know somebody personally, Dr. Margaret Flowers from Baltimore, who was at the Senate Health Care Committee hearings before the Obamacare bill was passed, in which Democratic Senator Max Baucus chaired those hearings for about a week's time, in which he only allowed corporate health insurance lobbyists to testify at. Even though the Medicare for All single payer movement, as well as the Steelworkers and the National Nurses Union, had petitioned to speak at that hearing well over a month before the hearing began. On the last day of the hearing, when Dr. Margaret Flowers stood up and said, "Are we going to be allowed to also testify today, the last day of the hearing?" Senator Max Baucus' response was, "Get more Capitol Police in here." At that point, over 100 healthcare activists were arrested, because at that time they realized that they weren't going to be allowed to speak, and they just started standing up and starting to talk about the benefits of Medicare for All, because that is the only solution to our healthcare crisis in this country. Obamacare was nothing but a distraction and a diversion to prevent Medicare single payer for all. I have argued relentlessly with people I know that I like, even some I call friends, who believed otherwise. And the thing is like I told them then, and I'm still saying it now, it seems like they haven't learned anything. For the first part, the biggest advocates of Obamacare are the ones who don't need to use it. The ones who advocate for it are ones with good jobs, with employer-based health care, or are wealthy enough to where they have no problems affording private health insurance. It's not the people that are working poor that are forced to have to either pay a fine because they can't afford to buy the health insurance on the exchanges, or that if they buy it, scrape together the money to buy it, that they can't afford to use it. And this is the problem, because instead of eliminating the source of our healthcare problem in this country, which is the private corporate health insurance industry, this bill expanded the private corporate health insurance industry. And that's why I say good riddance, because now, instead of trying to focus on trying to get the Affordable Care Act back in the law, we should focus on what we should have done in the first place in 2009 and demand single-payer Medicare for all, the system of health care that Canada and Western Europe and many other countries around the world have, in which nobody is denied health care. In the United States, over 50,000 people die needlessly every year because of treatable health care conditions because they're denied health care. Over 1 million people declare bankruptcy because of medical bills in this country every year. The second leading cause of bankruptcy. Obamacare did nothing to slow down or eliminate that. And so now, instead of like all the liberals running around screaming, "Oh my God, we got to save the Affordable Care Act," no, we're going to do what we should have done in 2009. We should have told Obama and the Democrats who sabotaged this and got the Affordable Care Act to say, "No, we don't want this piece of crap. We want Medicare single payer for all," and that needs to be where we need to focus and fight for.
And in fact, what may happen here is that the repeal of Obamacare is exactly what's necessary to alert people for the need for single payer for Medicare for all. That in a way, the government has let the camel get its nose under the edge of the tent with Obamacare, and its deficiencies become evident just as you describe, David. But people say that they notice the withdrawal of the palliative that Obamacare was, and say, all right, now finally we do need something serious here. So maybe they've dug their own grave.
But is this? I'm not sure if this is a done deal. I haven't followed it as closely as you. I assume it has a ways to go before
yes.
it
has
really
to pass
is
the
repealed.
House. Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, I find myself in the place of sort of having to stick up for a program I didn't support, but at least for the sake of covering all our bases here. Certainly plenty of people who have had a relatively more predictable and secure life in terms of getting on Obamacare, and that will be lost. And the question is, it won't be immediately replaced by payer health care or anything else. And
But may energize the drive for it.
it may, but that, to put...
Once you've had a taste, as it were.
But but to take all those people out of that relatively more secure space with the hopes of a political movement that doesn't exist in any effective way right now yet. I mean, obviously, I was as appalled by you, David, as you were, David, by the fact that, and I wasn't surprised, of course. It was clear Obama was going to be a corporate president. It was clear he was going to take the public option off the table, just as Hillary Clinton had done in 1993. And it was clear that this wasn't, and it's clear, as Andrew Levine said in his column on Counterpunch this morning, the only reason why Republicans hate Obamacare is because of his name on it. It's basically the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank. It's basically Romney Care.
It's Romney Care,
and
exactly.
So
pioneered in Massachusetts.
I'll in the spirit, Carl, of your doubting what's going down in the Electoral College today or in the Congress, let me say I'll put my doubts on whether all things being equal, the Congress is really going to go through, or Trump will allow them to go through with getting rid of Obamacare, because it's pretty firmly institutionalized in the lives of a lot of people, in the way insurance companies operate these days, obviously for worse. But the bottom line, David, you're absolutely right. We're on the same page. We spend $10,000 per person on healthcare in this country, where other developed nations spend anywhere from $4,000 to maybe $7,000.
And get better health care.
And get universal health care and get better outcomes. So in terms of how the basic measures of how long people live and so forth. So what does it mean that we spend $1 trillion more than we have to? What does that mean in labor terms? That $1 trillion goes into the pockets of the shareholders of the pharmaceutical companies and the health insurance companies. What would that money do? In other words, what labor could be? What labor replaces that $1 trillion to add to the lives of people in this country? That's what people ought to be asking. How that $1 trillion, which represents labor, either actual labor, or in a sense labor that isn't really being used, how could that be used either within healthcare or other aspects of healthcare or beyond healthcare?
I think one of the most interesting recent developments in discussions like this is the rise of the seriousness with which a universal basic income is being taken. The notion that, well, we need jobs, even we get that from the Trump campaign, and obviously made a difference. So it's an infrastructure program that would produce jobs and so forth, bring those jobs home from China and Mexico and so forth. All of that resonated with the American public and helped to make Trump president. But a number of people pointed out that the jobs that people remember from 1980, say, that went to China and Mexico aren't coming back under any circumstances, as if one can simply open up the factories that people worked in 1980, or begin the sort of production that was being carried on within the United States before the financialization of the American economy in the last 40 years. That's not going to happen. Something else is going to be necessary. And the statistics on the jobs that were created since the 2008 recession make this very clear. These jobs are not the old jobs that people have in mind, and the significance of Trump's making America great again for an awful lot of Americans was the attempt to try to establish economic circumstances they remember from their parents' lives. That's not going to happen. Something else is going to be necessary. We're not going to have auto workers in Youngstown, Ohio in 2020 the way they were in 1980. The problem runs deeper than that. And I think the quite remarkable explosion of consideration of universal basic income, which is being instituted in places as separate as Scotland and Finland, is going to be an issue in the coming year as it becomes clear that Trump's not able to produce those the economic circumstances that Obama didn't produce either. I think we'll hear more about it.
Just one brief comment, perhaps relevant to this. There was a wonderful, David Harvey, the Marxist geographer and anthropologist, gave a talk recently that was on alternative radio podcast in the last week. And I think I might even order a transcript of that because I think it's the most concise summary of capitalism, of the failure of capitalism that I've heard, in spite of having read a lot of what David Harvey and heard him in many contexts. That I think the most interesting thing he said that I hadn't ever heard him say in quite that way is that we talk about poverty. Is how do we eliminate poverty? How do we deal with poverty? And he said poverty isn't the problem. Wealth is the problem. The vast accumulation of wealth in relatively few hands, well beyond what it was in this country in the 1960s and 70s, as has been well documented by Thomas Piketty and other people. Besides giving a universal basic income, we have to understand. I don't think people really understand that this wealth is based on criminal behavior, on what should be criminal behavior, and I think the manner in which the more people understand the way Wall Street works and the way people who control, the relatively small number of people with direct access from Wall Street to Washington. You've got to include the military-industrial complex in all of that. You've got to include Silicon Valley in all of that. This relatively small number of people control vast amounts of wealth, and David Harvey is very clear in saying that has to be over for all the reasons that I'm sure people well understand. Not just social reasons, but environmental reasons. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done before people, I think, really begin to understand how unfair the system. People know the system is unfair. They don't quite know how unfair it is and how it is unfair.
Well, it's even more than that, David. Wealth is extreme wealth is anti-democratic because when certain individuals are able to obtain a level of wealth to where they can actually control our elected officials, to where they can control the policies of our government, they can control almost everything that affects our lives. That's not democratic. That's not the will of the people. You have a case of George Soros, who was able to crash the British pound sterling back, I think it was in the late 90s or so, just by using his wealth. And it's just not. No one should. Why should anybody? You're telling me somebody can't make it on $1 million a year? I mean, why should anybody be able to have more than $1 million a year in income? It's obscene, especially when the fact that when you have people that are homeless, the fact that you have people without health care, and you have people that are barely getting by. The thing is about Carl, your remark about those jobs never coming back. Well, my response to that is, where there's a will, there's a way. If we had a people's government come into power, it'd be real simple. It's like, okay,
you could build
these
factories.
As long as people are buying cars in this country, there's a demand. Okay,
people aren't buying cars, David.
But they are buying cars.
Yeah, they are
as
buying
much as
cars.
they were.
And we shouldn't be selling them to them anyhow. The car is a
okay. It's not just the automobile.
That's
it's not just the automobile industry. What I'm saying is manufacturing in general. Yeah. Slap tariffs on these individual not countries, but the individual firms that are exploiting sweatshop labor in other countries. Make the tariff, the differential between the wage rates in, say, Bangladesh or Mexico, comparable to what the average rate in that industry is here in the United States, and that's your tariff. You see how fast these jobs will start coming back to the United States.
Yeah.
Not at the, while I say this, I don't want to advocate or make people misunderstand that I want to abandon workers in other countries. Because what has to happen is we need to change this whole economic, international economic system in the sense right now it's made for wealthy people and corporations to exploit working people. And what I want to see is a development to where individual countries and regions can develop their, raise their standard of living, develop their own markets, and from that have international trade, as opposed to how it is now, to where corporations, they even do it with individual states and communities here in the country. If you don't give them what they want, they're going to move over to Indiana or North Carolina or somewhere. Likewise, they'll move out of the United States to, say, Mexico, Bangladesh, or some other hellhole in the lesser developed world where people will work for less money.
Well, clearly we need a more directed economy.
Yes.
People shouldn't, wealthy entrepreneurs or corporations shouldn't be allowed to go and build automobiles that pollute the atmosphere and so forth. We should have a rational national transportation system that would, for example, make something of the 19th century railroads that exist in this country and move them in the direction of modern railroad systems such as China has. Mm-hmm. We should get rid of the internal combustion engine as a primary means of transportation in the country. But that's not going to happen through, quote, the free market, close quote,
correct,
which you would point out is not free at all. That would not, but rather run by the major corporate interests and rich people. That's not going to happen without a democratic polity deciding that we're going to do this, we're going to provide transportation as we provide education and health care on the basis of need, not of profit, and that has to be done, as it were, from the top down. That has to be done nationally, that has to be done in a large scale. We can't allow people simply to go out and say, I'm going to open up an automobile factory because I have several $1 billion sitting in my bank account that I don't know what to do with.
Well, that, planning is necessary, but it also has to have democratic control at the local level. So I'll add that caveat to it.
One of the sort of ideological aspects that have been foisted on us in the last since World War II really is that planning, central, quote unquote, central planning doesn't work because of the Soviet Union. I mean, that was the best example of you just can't have central economic planning to any great level. And one thing David Harvey pointed out in his talk, which the title of the talk was "How Will Capitalism End?" How Will Capitalism End? I think was the title of that talk. And that's also the title of a book coming out by somebody else, a guy named Wolfgang Streeck. I don't know whether it just sort of got the wires crossed there. But in any event, what Harvey pointed out in his talk was that the corporate leaders were scared to death after World War II because during World War II they were told to plan an economy to produce the things needed to win the war, and that's exactly what they did. And it proved extremely successful in terms of its stated goals. And in the midst of that, workers rebelled for better wages during the war and after the war. So the project after the war was to disclaim the basic success of the war effort, of the planned war effort, and to reinstitute this idea that you can't have central planning. And ever since they've been deriding the idea that we could have a planned economy. And of course there's things to be said about the Soviet Union, and there's things to be said democratically, David, of course, about what that planning would constitute at federal, state, and local levels. But we absolutely need planning, and we need to stop talking, making it like making planning a kind of obscene word, because corporations plan every day what they're going to do, except they're planning it in a way to screw the working class.
Yes, indeed, and in fact, if you look at China's huge rise in their economy over the last 20 years, you don't see many of these stories. I mean, they occasionally creep into the financial papers or other sources. here in the United States, but you'll see that China has used a lot of central planning to, like for instance, to expand their high-speed rail networks, to produce alternative energy and other things quite successfely. The Soviet Union, I mean, let's face it, I mean, the Soviet Union was never democratic. I mean, Russia, I should say, before the Soviet Union was never democratic. It was never economically advanced. So, I mean, it's always like they're trying to compare apples to onions. But I think it should be a mixed economy, personally. I think you need central planning in a lot of areas, but I also think you need worker-owned cooperatives. Instead of bailing out auto companies when they fail and other industries, bailing out the same company, the same management that got them into the situation in the first place, usually on the backs of the workers in those factories. Why not just give that money, the bailout money, to the workers and have them run the factory? Some people may think this is utopian. However, it's been proven that it works. In the case of Argentina, when they had an economic meltdown back in 99, 2000, that's the only thing that brought back the economy, was when the workers went, and a lot of workers went and reoccupied their closed factories and started producing the goods people needed. Everything from pasta to shoes to machine parts.
One problem here is that we're discussing this as if it's a matter of bad ideas that people have. So I have a bad idea. People don't understand the need for central planning, say, or people don't understand the need for a coordinated economy as occurred during the Second World War in order to accomplish certain social gains and so forth. That may all be true, but there's something else too. There are active forces working against it. We were talking before the program tonight about the remarkable transformations that took place in what I'm happy to be able to call simply the Clinton administration, not the first Clinton administration, of the 1990s. When the U.S. and its European clients set out to destroy the best example of a independent, popular economy that existed in the world. That was in Yugoslavia. And the Yugoslavian War, which most people have forgotten about, Bill Clinton's attack on Yugoslavia in 1999, was talked about at the time, sold to Americans at the time, media cooperated in its usual fashion, as a responsibility to protect. We're going to help these people who are being oppressed by this terrible government under President Milosevic in Serbia. We did not hear the story, most Americans, about the eventual dismissal of all of those charges that the U.S. brought about Milosevic just before he died in custody in the United Nations. And we also did not hear about the fact that the real reason that the U.S. and its European clients set out to destroy Serbia was that it was not down with the program. It was not part of this free neoliberal, quote, free market, and as we've said many times on this program, neoliberalism does not mean free markets in any literal sense of the term. It was not down with this neoliberal program that enriched the few. It really was a socialist, lowercase s, economy. And therefore it had to be destroyed. And they destroyed it. The Clinton administration came into office in the wake of the disappearance of the Soviet Union and made very clear that the result of that disappearance meant that the U.S. could organize the world economy as it wished for the benefit of the American 1% without let or hindrance by any other major power. That led to the fate of Serbia. That led to the subjugation of Europe, the continued and completing the completion of the subjugation of Europe to the American economy that produced austerity in Europe, and the conscious attempt of the Clinton administration to turn Russia now into a third world economy that provided some raw materials that were needed for the advanced world, i.e. us. That was, as I say, the conscious intent of the Clinton administration. The reason Vladimir Putin is hated so desperately by the American political establishment is that he, not single-handedly, but he at the head of a movement, reversed that Clinton plan. I mean, Putin's plan and Clinton plan are personalized, but we're talking about what these policies did, and prevented the subjugation of Russia to the status of a third world country like Serbia. This is the reason that we have these absolutely hysterical, mad notions about the dangers posed by Vladimir Putin to the, quote, democratic world, close quote, capital D or lowercase d as you prefer. This is an amazing story, and it's a story that we're very much in the midst of right now, but the important part about it is that it has to be completely misrepresented to the American public. The only way the U.S. public would support the sort of depredations that are being carried out by our government at home and abroad is that they're completely misrepresented. People are not fools. You have to make sure they believe things that are not the case in order for the American 1% to accomplish its aims, and it finds faithful minions in people like Barack Obama. The great fight in Washington these days arises from the tremendous fear by the American 1% is that Donald Trump is not reliable in this way, that he's a loose cannon, that strange things will happen here, and he can't be counted on, as all recent presidents have, to continue the neoliberal and neocon activities that the American government has engaged in for a generation. The jury's out. The jury is meeting, in one part of the jury is meeting right now in the House chamber in the American Congress. But the story's not over by any means.
But the most crucial tell for that is going to be whether he really pursues rejection of Obama's Iran deal. That is the most radically neoconservative thing that he says he's going to do, and he's hired people who want to do it along with him. So whether that can actually happen, as Medea Benjamin pointed out in her, she's been being interviewed by Paul Jay recently, worth watching, and she points out what is true is that this wasn't a bilateral deal. This was a deal that involved other countries. So just like with Obamacare, and perhaps with the Iran deal, Trump may be more bluster than one would hope that it's mostly bluster. Well, but that's the neocon side of things. That's going to be a big deal as to whether he goes forward with the sort of assertiveness that
there's some good signs.
The Zionists would like to see.
James Woolsey bailed.
The Saudis, actually.
James Woolsey bailed today. Woolsey is this half-mad director of the CIA under Clinton in those days, who was on Trump's transition team as the fight between the permanent government as represented by the CIA and the incoming Trump administration carries on. Woolsey said this morning, "My God, I'm on the wrong side. I've got to get out of here."
Meaning what? What are the implications of that? Good or bad? Are you saying?
Oh, I'm saying it's a very good sign because Woolsey is a dangerous spook, and his willingness to be part of the Trump transition team represented to a lot of people a very bad sign indeed, and that sign has now been countered. So we're talking about things that we, inshallah, will be able to talk again about next week in the same time and place on News from Neptune. Our thanks to Yosef and Jason, our directors and producers, and inshallah we will be back in a week to discuss the news of the week and its coverage by the media on News from Neptune. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.